For weeks, questions surrounding Nolan Wells have continued to grow, and now Dr. Umar is speaking at length about the case, the timeline, the people who may have last seen Nolan alive, and the details surrounding that boat trip that he believes deserve much closer attention. But before we get into the strongest parts of what Dr. Umar said, there is one thing you need to understand. A large part of his argument comes down to time, not just when Nolan was last seen, but whether the different accounts of those final hours actually fit together. And if you're new here, welcome. Please subscribe to the page and stay with us as we take a closer look at what happened to Nolan Wells. According to the material we are examining, one witness said Nolan was seen at approximately 3:40 in the afternoon. Another account placed a conversation with him sometime between 3 o'clock and 4:30. A coach was reportedly said to have spoken with Nolan sometime between 2:30 and 3:30. Those may sound like small differences at first, but in an investigation involving a person's final known movements, minutes can matter. And Dr. Umar repeatedly returned to that point. He questioned whether the different accounts were placing Nolan's last known interactions too early, potentially creating a narrow window around what happened afterward. He did not simply focus on one person. He compared the accounts of Javon, Katie, and the coach, and asked whether their timelines actually made sense when placed beside one another. That is where this story becomes much more complicated. According to the source material, Katie said she spoke with Nolan sometime between 3 o'clock and 4:30. Javon reportedly placed his last sighting around 3:40, while the coach's reported window ended around 3:30. Dr. Umar's question was straightforward. If all three people were around Nolan during those final hours, did they see one another? And if they did not, how could their accounts be reconciled? He was careful at points to say that he was not accusing these individuals of taking Nolan's life. Instead, he raised the possibility that someone could have been a witness without being involved in the death itself. That distinction is important. A person does not have to be responsible for a crime to become important to an investigation. Sometimes, the most important information comes from someone who happened to see or speak with a person shortly before something happened. And that is why Dr. Umar kept returning to the timeline. He argued that if three people independently placed their final contact with Nolan around roughly the same period, investigators should establish exactly where each person was, who else was present, and whether those accounts overlap. Then there is another detail: the emergency call. According to the source material, an emergency call was made at approximately 4 p.m. That puts the reported emergency call very close to the time period being discussed. So now you have a sequence that deserves to be laid out carefully. Nolan was reportedly seen earlier in the afternoon. Different people gave different windows for their final conversations with him. An emergency call was made around 4 o'clock, and questions remained about what happened between those events. For an older viewer, following a complicated investigation, this is the part that can easily become confusing. So slow it down. The question is not simply, who saw Nolan? The bigger question is, what did each person see? When did they see it? And what happened immediately afterward? Those are different questions, and Dr. Umar's commentary focused heavily on that distinction. He also pointed to the emergency call itself as something that deserved attention. According to the source material, the person making the call reportedly told the operator that Nolan had stayed behind with Katie. But Katie's account was described differently. She reportedly said Nolan told her he needed to return to the boat because his friends were preparing to leave. If those accounts are accurately represented, there is a direct contradiction. One account has Nolan staying behind. The other has Nolan heading back toward the boat. And that difference matters because it could change the timeline of Nolan's final known movements. But there was another detail in the emergency call that Dr. Umar considered particularly troubling. The operator reportedly asked how many adults were on the boat. The answer, according to the source, was that there were no adults. The operator then continued asking questions about how many people were actually on board. Eventually, the response was reportedly something along the lines of, like 7, and this is where Dr. Umar began asking a much larger question. Why say, like 7, if the number of people on the boat was supposed to be known? According to the source material, the boat had gone out with 8 people, including Nolan. So the difference between 7 and 8 suddenly becomes extremely important, because if Nolan was supposed to be one of those 8 people, then saying there were like 7 could raise an obvious question. Where was Nolan? Dr. Umar interpreted that wording as potentially significant. But it is important to separate his interpretation from an established fact. The source material does not establish why the person used that wording. That is precisely why the statement deserves examination rather than assumption. There is also the operator's response. According to the material, the operator asked whether anyone was breathing or alive on the boat. Dr. Umar questioned why those particular questions were being asked and whether the operator had heard something in the background that prompted them. Again, the available material does not establish what the operator heard or why she chose those words. But it does establish that the questions were asked, and that has become part of the discussion surrounding the call. And this is where the story begins to move beyond a simple question about when Nolan was last seen. Now the focus turns toward the boat itself, the emergency call, the number of people who were reportedly aboard, and the statements made during those critical minutes. Because, if the timeline is correct, the difference between what Nolan was reportedly doing before the emergency call and what people said afterward could be extremely important. And there is still another piece of this story that Dr. Umar believes deserves attention. It involves what happened to Nolan's phone and keys after he disappeared. That detail may seem separate from the timeline at first, but once you understand where the phone was reportedly found and how Nolan's family became involved in recovering it, the questions surrounding those final hours become even more difficult to ignore. And that is where we will pick up the story next. And that brings us to Nolan's phone. According to the source material, Nolan's mother and another family member eventually went looking for the phone after realizing that it was reportedly inside the home of one of the young people connected to the boat trip. That detail raised questions for Dr. Umar because, in his telling, Nolan's family had reason to believe the phone was there before they went to retrieve it. The important point is what happened next. According to the account presented in the source material, there was a delay of approximately 15 minutes before the phone was brought out. Dr. Umar questioned why it took that long. He suggested that the delay could have been connected to people deleting information from Nolan's Snapchat account or discussing what they were going to say. That is an allegation, not an established finding, and the available material does not independently prove what happened during those 15 minutes. But the delay itself became part of the story, and for Nolan's family, this was not simply about recovering a missing phone. The phone could potentially contain information about Nolan's movements, his communications, his location, and the people he had been communicating with before he disappeared. That is why the circumstances surrounding the phone became so important. The source material also describes a concern that Nolan's family members may have been told that the people inside the house did not know where the phone was, even though the family believed the phone was there. If accurate, that would create another contradiction that investigators would need to examine carefully. But there is something else we need to remember. A phone is not automatically proof of a crime. Finding someone's phone at another person's home does not, by itself, establish who took it, why it was there, or what happened before it arrived. Those questions require evidence. That distinction becomes particularly important in a case where emotions are already running high. Dr. Umar, however, went further. He questioned why the boats involved in the trip were not, in his view, treated as potential crime scenes. According to the source material, the group had been on boats around Horn Island, and there were reportedly multiple boats involved. Dr. Umar argued that investigators should have examined all of them thoroughly. He also questioned why the original boat was returned to its owner if investigators had not completely ruled out the possibility that it contained evidence. Again, those are his criticisms of the investigation. The material does not establish every detail of what law enforcement did or did not examine, so those claims should be understood as questions raised by Dr. Umar rather than settled findings. Still, the question is significant. If investigators believe a death was accidental, the way they approach physical evidence can be very different from the way they would approach a suspected homicide. That brings us back to the central issue surrounding Nolan's death. What did investigators believe happened in those first hours? And what evidence did they have when they reached that conclusion? Dr. Umar argued that the drowning explanation deserved much more scrutiny. He repeatedly questioned whether Nolan could have accidentally drowned, particularly because he described Nolan as a strong swimmer. But once again, that is Dr. Umar's position. It is not enough to establish what happened. The actual cause and circumstances of Nolan's death have to come from evidence, medical findings, witness statements, and the official investigation. And there was another part of the story that drew Dr. Umar's attention: the emergency call itself. Think about what an emergency operator would normally need to know. How many people are on the boat? Where are you? What happened? Who is missing? Is anyone injured? Those basic questions become especially important when the answers appear unclear. According to the source material, the operator repeatedly asked how many people were on the boat. The response reportedly changed from saying there were no adults to saying everyone was under 21, and eventually to saying there were like 7 people. The operator reportedly pressed for a direct answer. That sequence is important because the boat was said to have left with 8 people. If 7 people were now aboard, then someone was missing, and that someone was Nolan. The question is why the number was not immediately stated clearly. We cannot know from this material exactly what was happening on the boat at that moment. We cannot know what the person making the call was thinking. And we cannot assume that an unclear answer proves criminal conduct. But the call gives investigators something concrete to examine: the exact wording, the timing, the background sounds, the responses to the operator, and what happened immediately before and after the call. Those details can sometimes tell investigators more than a later recollection given days or weeks afterward. That is one reason emergency calls are often so important in investigations. They capture a moment while events are still unfolding. There is also another question surrounding the people who were reportedly with Nolan that day. If several individuals spoke with him during the afternoon, investigators would need to establish where those people were when the emergency call came in. Did their locations match their statements? Did their accounts match one another? Did anyone see Nolan after the times they reported? And perhaps most importantly, did anyone witness something that could explain how Nolan went from being part of the group to being missing? These are questions. They are not answers. And that distinction matters because the public can easily turn an unanswered question into an accusation. Dr. Umar's commentary, however, repeatedly pushed viewers to look closely at those unanswered questions. He also criticized what he described as a lack of transparency around the investigation. According to the source material, he questioned why the other boats were not examined and why more information had not been made public. He also raised questions about whether phones and social media accounts connected to the group should have received greater scrutiny. But the available material does not give us enough information to determine exactly what investigators examined privately, what evidence they collected, or what they may have withheld from the public. That is an important limitation. Sometimes investigators do not release information because a case is active. Sometimes evidence is being analyzed. Sometimes officials deliberately keep certain details private because releasing them could affect witnesses or a future prosecution. So the absence of public information does not automatically mean that no investigation took place. But it does explain why families and viewers may continue demanding answers. And in Nolan's case, the timeline remains the thread connecting nearly every major question. The phone, the boat, the emergency call, the different accounts of when Nolan was last seen, and the unexplained gap between the last reported contact and the moment help was requested. Put those pieces together, and there is one question that becomes harder to avoid. What happened during that gap? Because somewhere between Nolan's last known conversations and that emergency call, something happened that left his family searching for answers. And according to Dr. Umar, that is precisely the period investigators need to examine most carefully. But there is one more detail that makes the emergency call even more significant. It concerns what the operator was reportedly hearing and asking while the people on the boat were trying to explain what was happening. And once you look closely at those questions, the call takes on an entirely different importance. The emergency call may be one of the most important pieces of information discussed by Dr. Umar, because it captures a moment when the situation was still unfolding. According to the source material, the operator repeatedly asked how many people were on the boat. Instead of giving a clear number immediately, the response reportedly changed, eventually becoming, like 7. That wording has become one of the questions surrounding the case. The boat was reportedly carrying 8 people earlier that day, including Nolan. So if 7 people were now aboard, the obvious question was where Nolan was. The operator also reportedly asked whether anyone was breathing or alive on the boat. Dr. Umar questioned what prompted those questions, and whether the operator had heard something in the background that caused her concern. The available material does not establish what the operator heard, so that remains an unanswered question. And that is important because there are several things we still cannot say with certainty. We cannot establish from these statements alone what happened to Nolan. We cannot determine why someone reportedly used the phrase, like 7, and we cannot assume that an unclear emergency call proves that anyone committed a crime. What we can say is that the call provides a specific moment that investigators can examine alongside the other evidence. The timing matters, the statements matter, the phone matters, and the different accounts of Nolan's final movements matter. Dr. Umar has argued that these details deserve much more scrutiny, particularly the period between Nolan's last reported sightings and the emergency call. That period remains central to the questions surrounding the case. For Nolan's family, the most important question is still the simplest one. What happened to him during those final hours? And for investigators, answering that question means establishing exactly where everyone was, what they saw, what they said, and what evidence supports each version of events. Some details may eventually be explained by evidence that the public has not seen. Other questions may require investigators to revisit statements and timelines that have already been discussed. For now, the available information leaves important gaps. And those gaps are precisely why people continue to examine the case. So what do you think? Do the different timelines and the emergency call details raise legitimate questions that deserve another look? Or do you believe there may be explanations that the public simply does not know yet? Let me know your thoughts respectfully in the comments. And if you want more detailed updates and long-form coverage of cases like this, subscribe and stay with us as new information becomes available.